All right, we're going to start our Bible class this morning. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. Is there a lot of Irish people that settled in Wyoming? Is that a thing? I just remember, because the whole West was just, settled by, people that were in the East and then came out West. And so I just assume you guys know in Back to the Future 3, right, where Marty goes back into the Western time. And what's his ancient... what his ancestor was? Seamus McFly, and he was Irish. I didn't know if there is any accuracy to that or not, of people settling in same areas out here in the West. But it is interesting how traditions and stuff like that gets started. Of you have to wear green on St. Patrick's Day, or else is it you get pinched, or where does the whole "kiss me, I'm Irish" thing come in?
Okay. I have no idea. Like I said, I was talking to Wes and Candy that my
non-Korean side is all German, so there's no I guess Oktoberfest, right? That would be a German type holiday, but there's just okay, we're just German. It's fine. Anyways, that has nothing to do with Thomas today, but it is St. Patrick's Day. Thomas actually, we're going to find out, he actually went the opposite direction from Ireland with where he took the gospel. So, anyways, what is courage?
If you had to define it, what's courage? Yeah.
Being scared to death and doing it anyway.
John Wayne? There's something about a saddle in that saying for him, though, right? Being scared to death and saddling up anyways. Pilgrim. What else? I mean, is that pretty much it?
I think it's stepping outside your comfort zone.
Okay. Getting it outside of your comfort zone. Very true. I have a sticky note in my office that says there's no growth in the comfort zone, and there's no comfort in the growth zone.
True.
Yeah, write that on a sticky note. Put it in your office. Any other thoughts on courage? I think that pretty much sums it up, right? Being scared, but doing it anyways. Let me ask you this. It might be a little more variation on this one. What does it mean to be a pessimist? What's a pessimist?
Assuming everything is going to go wrong.
Assuming everything's going to go wrong?
Glass half full.
Glass half empty?
Or half full. Murphy's Law.
Half full will be the optimist. I'm the glass half full guy.
Murphy's Law.
Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will.
Murphy was an optimist.
Murphy was an optimist.
Compared to Troy.
Okay. I don't want a show of hands, but you pessimists that are out there, you know who you are. And so today's lesson on Thomas might be especially fitting for you. We like to call him Doubting Thomas, right? Is that fair, though? It's kind of mean-spirited, right? Imagine if someone called you that. Doubting Chris. You just... we know who you are. You're always like this. You're just a doubter. But he was much more... he was a much better man than a simple skeptic, because that's what we think of. I mean, that title, doubter. That's what I think, right? It's like if someone called me a doubter, that means that I'm a skeptic. And it's fair to think. I think it is fair to think of him as a negative person. We might call these people today worrywarts, right? Or a brooder, or someone who is anxious. I always think of in the account that we're going to look at this morning. I always think of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, right? Okay, like here we go. He just anticipated the worst all of the time. His name, Thomas, means twin, and so he's also called Didymus, which is twin in Greek. Apparently he had a twin brother or sister, but were never introduced to his twin, or maybe they just like the name Thomas. Because apparently, a lot of people in ancient times, they chose names for a reason. But when you look at even the name Jacob, means it has a negative connotation to it of one who grabs the heel, or being a liar or a thief, and yet people still name their kids Jacob. Not today, Jacob, but back then when it's like that's what they thought of, they still did it. And so maybe Thomas is just a name that they liked. Everything that we know about Thomas, just like Nathaniel, is from John's Gospel. We don't see his calling in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's just listed as part of the 12. It's only in John's Gospel that we see Thomas actually say things. And from these accounts, we get kind of an idea of what his personality or what his character was. And so we're going to start in John chapter 11. Actually, we're going to start just a little bit before that, but what we're going to be looking at is in John chapter 11. To set the scene, let me read chapter 10, verses 40 through 42. It says, "He went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first, and there he remained. And they came to him, and they said, 'John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true.' And many believed in him there." Scholars believe that this was during a time, or this section here in John depicts one of the most fruitful times in Jesus' ministry, where he was a little bit further away from Jerusalem, and so then he would be further away from his opposition a lot of times. And so there was great growth happening during this time. Opposition was minimal. People were very responsive, as we see, and many believed in him there. And then we get to chapter 11. Which this is one of my favorite passages or pericopes in the entire Bible, because it talks about the death and resurrection of a man named Lazarus. So we're going to go through this section by section.
through the first 16 verses here, so we get the scene and understand what is happening here. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 11 says this. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. Bethany was on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Okay, so this would be much, much closer to Jerusalem than where Jesus was currently at. Jesus had formed a loving relationship with this family, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. That we see these characters a few times through the story of Jesus, and Jesus loved and had a very special place in his heart for this family in particular. Verse 3, it says, So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. They knew that Jesus would be able to heal him. Obviously, right? That's one of the things that Jesus was known for and was doing in the area. And this presented a problem for Jesus, though. If he went that close to Jerusalem, he would be walking into the very teeth of the enemy. That the people, Jesus attracted a crowd literally everywhere he went, and especially during the height of his ministry at this point in time. Even if he tried to keep it quiet, to keep it a secret, word would get to the opposition eventually. And at that time, they had already determined to kill Jesus, and in fact, Jesus has already eluded their grasp once when they were trying to stone him. And so, if he returned to Bethany, they would try to seize him again. All right, a little background information. Verse 4, it says, But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Lazarus' death would not be the ultimate result of this sickness. He says this, right? He tells the people that he's with, he's sure Lazarus is sick, and he says it will not lead to death, but it's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. All right. Verses 5 and 6. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. This is an interesting statement. These two sentences don't seem like they would go together. It says Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus, and it's because of that love, then we get verse 6 where it says, So, or because he loved them, he waited. Which is kind of a weird statement to make when you know what the sisters were wanting, right? Hey, come quick before Lazarus dies so that you can heal him. And now, this is one great piece of evidence for the fact that I think Jesus knew that he was going to do this all along, and that he wasn't surprised when he got there to find Lazarus dead. But that's not really the focus on what we're going to be looking at this morning. The way Jesus saw this was his waiting and allowing Lazarus to die was going to be was an act of love for not only his disciples but also for Martha and Mary, for the blessing he was going to show them. Of course, as is the case most of the times with Jesus' interactions with his disciples, they couldn't see it. Verses 7 and 8. It says, Then after this he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. And the disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going there again? This gives us a little insight into how the disciples were thinking, right? They get the message from Mary and Martha, say, hey, Lazarus is sick, and Jesus says, we're actually going to wait. And it seemingly the disciples at that statement went, okay, we're going to stay here. Good deal. I mean, so sorry for Lazarus. That's tough. That's tough. But at least we're safe here. And then Jesus says, okay, now he's ready to go. Now he's ready to go back to Judea, back to Jerusalem, back to Bethany, to where Lazarus was. And this is what the disciples, their first thought was, weren't they just trying to stone you there, and you want to go back? Like we barely escaped with our lives the first time. And it's like, you want to tempt fate again? Oh boy. Verses 9 and 10. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. This is one of these cryptic responses, cryptic sayings that Jesus responded with here. Basically, the general idea, as long as it's day, there's work to be done. And Jesus is the light of the world, and that they would be fine as long as they stayed in his light. I think that's what Jesus was trying to say there. In verses 11 and 12, it continues on. After these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. And the disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he'll recover. Jesus is trying here to not ruin the surprise of what he was going to do, and so he tries to break it to them softly. Like, Lazarus has fallen asleep, I'm going to go there to wake him up, and they're like, Jesus, if he's asleep, he's going to wake up on his own. Completely like missing it, like zoom right over his head, right over their heads, right, of like. And I can only imagine the look on Jesus's face at that comment, which leads him then to just come out with it plainly in verses 13 through 15. Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he was talking about rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Jesus tells them plainly. And then it's the realization, the realness of the situation, I think, would be starting to dawn on the disciples. One, not only was it like Lazarus is gone. As much as Jesus had a relationship with Lazarus and this entire family, so would the disciples. The disciples went everywhere with Jesus. And so they knew this family. They had interacted with this family. They had a history with this family. You would imagine, as close as Jesus was with this family, the disciples also had that same type of closeness with them. And so, I mean, one blow would be that Lazarus was dead. He's gone. And of course, I mean, their thoughts and ideas would be the same thoughts and ideas that we have when we hear someone has passed, right? That a lot of thoughts will be goes through our minds when we hear that someone that we love has died. Whether it's a family member or a friend, you think about the good times, you hope they didn't suffer. You think about their family and what are they going to do now, and you just feel grief and sorrow for when they're gone. But what these people weren't thinking, and the same thing we don't think of, is, I wonder if he's going to come back alive. I wonder if he's just going to, pop out of that casket. That's like so far out of our minds, and it wouldn't be in their minds either, right? It's the finality of death. He's not coming back. He is gone. But besides that, Jesus seems determined to go back to Bethany, to give his condolences, to give his encouragement or comfort to the sisters now. And that realization would also be dawning on them that, oh man, they were seeking to stone us, and Jesus is like, he's wanting to go, and so I guess that's where we're going. And it's Thomas that is the one that speaks up, that voices all of these concerns. It says in verse 16, so Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us go that we may die with him. And if there ever was a glass half empty statement, it might be this, right? Let's go. Lazarus is dead. Well, we might go die too. And this is Thomas. This is the first time, in all of the Gospels that we really get to see his character, and this is how he, this is his first impression. Well, let's go so that we'll all die together. At first glance, we might say that this is just typical doubting Thomas here. Doom and gloom, as always. I would like us to reframe this just a little bit. To instead of viewing this as doom and gloom, as just typical doubting Thomas here, as to see this as, if there ever was such a thing, as heroic pessimism. Okay? Heroic pessimism. Thomas was convinced that Jesus was headed straight into a stoning. And whereas Jesus was able to elude and evade these stonings over his ministry, most people, when it was determined that you were going to be stoned, that was a one-way ticket. Okay? And it wasn't like, oh, let me throw this little pebble at you, get out of our town. It was like, no, we're trying to bash your head in with these miniature boulders. And so a stoning wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to get out, with some bumps and bruises. It was a threat on your life. And Thomas was convinced that Jesus is heading straight into a stoning here, but if that is what the Lord was intended to do, Thomas was grimly determined to die with him. And that, right, we talked about courage at the beginning of the class. That's courage, right? Thomas is like, this situation that we're walking into is going to result in our deaths. Might be pessimistic, but he says we're going to go anyways. And that's courage. It's heroic pessimism. Thomas had the courage to be loyal even in the face of his pessimism. This was a great, I believe, demonstration of love. That he's basically making the statement that it's better to die and be with Christ than to be left behind. And this was also a great demonstration or a great example of strength to the rest of the apostles, because guess what? They all went with him. He had great devotion to Jesus, but also had no disillusions that following Jesus might cost him his life. In Matthew 10, verse 22, Jesus says, "And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." I talk about this with people that I study with when we talk about the cost of discipleship, that a lot of people think that like, man, when I become a Christian, then I won't have any problems anymore, because now I'm blessed, I'm redeemed, I'm favored by God. But Jesus himself, not just here, but multiple times, promises. In fact, when you start following him, don't be surprised if your life gets harder. And he says, you're going to be hated by all for my name's sake. Thomas could see clearly the consequences of following Jesus, and he went with him anyways. And that's courage. Let me ask you this. We aren't threatened with death for following Jesus today. Not yet, anyways, right? If you follow the, if you are a fan of history, as much as us as Americans feel invincible in our nation, we aren't guaranteed that our country is invincible, or that it might fall, and then Christianity might be outlawed or criminalized at some point. We don't know. It could be. It could. I mean, we've seen it in the past. But today we aren't really threatened with death. So how can the Christian show courage
today? Outside of walking into a possible stoning, what does courage look like in the life of a Christian today? Annette?
I think it's when you're trying to share his word with strangers.
Yeah, strangers, or I think it's even scarier when you try to share it with people you know.
Well, true.
Yeah. In my experience, strangers is easy because it's like if I see these people again or not, I don't know. That's why I like going and giving seminars at other churches or preaching for other in other congregations abroad. It's like I'm probably never going to see these people again. So if they hate me, whatever. Preaching for y'all, that's when I get a little nervous.
Tough crowd.
Yeah, I know. They didn't laugh at my joke. Oh no. How else?
It's being unpopular for your beliefs.
Ooh. Popularity. When we start playing that game, and because it feels good to be liked. It feels good to be on the inside. But when you're placed on the outside for your beliefs, that's tough. How else? Yeah, Monica.
Being the only one at work or at school who doesn't use bad language or tell bad jokes. And you're not really part of the group because you purposefully pull yourself out of that kind of behavior.
Yeah. Even before I was a preacher, preachers just get this automatically of, like someone will say a bad word and then you're like, oh, I said that in front of a preacher, as if I'm something special. But even like being in the military and being a Christian, people would just know, because I wouldn't use that language, that as soon as they started to tell a dirty joke or something not so nice, they would start apologizing immediately. And as much as it's like, I don't know why you're apologizing to me. Like, I know these words exist. But that behavior puts you on the outside. Makes you feel alone.
Too, Chris, the other day, I agree with Monica, and I think that's the hardest part for me is being at work. I was in a meeting and there was 5 men and I was the only woman there. And the language, oh my word, it was like they were feeding off each other. And you say something because my ears are blowing up. And it's like, oh, well, don't want to offend Judy. And then they diminish what you bring to the table because you're not part of it, you know?
Yeah.
And so they just kind of glaze over all the work you've brought to the
Yeah.
table.
If you would have delivered that with a few F-bombs in there, then
Oh, yeah.
that would be a much better plan.
Yeah.
But because you didn't, well, Judy, goody two shoes Judy, I don't even know what that means. Goody two shoes. Somebody Google that. Hit me up after class.
Let's just go with generally it's a negative comment.
Goody two shoes. You have two shoes. Look, you're so good. What does that even mean? Anyways.
Squirrel.
Even today, even though we have religious freedom and we have not just religious freedom, but the history of our country has been one where Christian principles are seen throughout its founding and its history. There's still a cost of discipleship that has to be paid. Next, we're going to go over to John chapter 14. John chapter 14, this is where we get the famous saying of Jesus that he is the way, the truth, and the life, that nobody comes to the Father except through him. But what precedes that, we get another quotation from Thomas here. Verses 1 through 5, this is what it says. Jesus says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, and where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going." That's the statement. You know the way to where I'm going. And Thomas said to him, "Lord, we do not know where you are going, and how can we know the way?" Thomas, in essence, says, you're leaving, and we will never get to where you are going. We don't know the way. Thomas's relationship with Jesus was so deep that he never wanted to be severed from him. He was broken at the thought. His life was starting to crumble around him as Jesus is layering here on all of the disciples this idea that Jesus is going to die. The thought of losing Jesus paralyzes Thomas here with fear. And he was devoted, and eventually here, so we get the statement, how can we know the way? And then Jesus, makes the statement, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." And then Thomas's worst fears are realized. His worst fears come to pass. Jesus died, and it's like the statement that he made back in chapter 11, I have to believe that it's not just the fact that Jesus died, but it's also Thomas feeling that he lived. There's this phenomenon out there called survivor's guilt. You ever heard of that? Survivor's guilt, right? Of people who have gone through a tragedy. We hear a lot about it in cases of school shootings nowadays, of people really wrestling with the fact of this, my friend died and yet I didn't. Right? Like it was just a matter of chance that the shooter picked this classroom and not this classroom. and they feel lucky to be alive, but also sad at their loss of their friend, and it's this kind of weird sense of like if they would have chose my classroom, then my friend still would be alive, but I would be dead, and it's like, man, how do you justify that? How do you balance that? It's so tough, and I have to think that perhaps when Thomas, it says all the disciples ran away. Some of them came back. We know Peter came back to see Jesus in the high priest's house at his mock trial. We know John followed Jesus pretty much that entire night and into the morning during the crucifixion and stuff like that. But those are the only two. And so survivor's guilt of like, Jesus died, I didn't, but also I ran away. So a lot of emotions, a lot of turmoil would be going on in Thomas at this point. And now let's go to chapter 20. This is obviously after Jesus' death. And resurrection, for that matter. But in verses 19 through 25, it says this: On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you withhold forgiveness from any, it is withheld." Now, Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." This is where we typically get the nickname Doubting Thomas from, right? Of that it was he wouldn't believe the other disciples when they said that they had seen Jesus. But I don't think we should be too hard on him, because the other disciples also didn't believe until they saw him, right? Even in Mark's accounting of this same time period, Mark 16 verses 9 through 13, it says, "Now when he arose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it." Right? So these other 10, other 10, right, I can math, also did the same thing in verses 12 and 13 of Mark 16. "After these things, he appeared to in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them." And so, as much as like, well, Thomas was the only one. He was the only one who didn't believe when he was told. And seemingly, all of the disciples did the same thing. Like Mary told them, and they're like, no way. And then then he appeared to some of the disciples, but not the entire group, and the rest of them said, "No way." They were all slow to believe. But what set Thomas apart from the other 10 was not that his doubt was great, but perhaps because his sorrow was greater. In verses 26 and 27 back in John chapter 20, it says, 8 days later his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus didn't belittle Thomas or scold him in any way. Thomas had erred because he was more or less wired to be a pessimist. No one could feel the way Thomas felt unless he loved Jesus the way that Thomas loved him. And in Hebrews 4:15 it says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." Our high priest, Jesus, is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. He understands our doubt. He sympathizes with our uncertainty. He is patient with our pessimism. And while recognizing these weaknesses, we must also acknowledge Thomas's heroic devotion to Christ, which made him understand that it would be better to die than to be separated from his Lord. Scott?
Even before just now, you had made the point of how dedicated Thomas was. And as I think we've all experienced or known people who great dedication can also lead to great disappointment. And when you're disappointed, you tend to be negative in that way. And I'm sure that's how Thomas was feeling. Because think about, all the ideas that they had of being with Jesus and a part of his group, these grandiose ideas, and all of a sudden,
He's dead.
For a short time.
Yeah. We talked about this
last week of Matthew, right? Someone who, like the other disciples, also gave up his job, but his job in particular was one where he was extremely affluent and wealthy, and it wasn't a job where he could just be like, "Oh, I'm just gonna go back to work now." Didn't work like that, and so. Yeah, during this time before Jesus's resurrection, I'm sure there was a lot of thoughts going through all of their heads of like, what do we do now? Like, this was not what was supposed to happen. But Thomas responds, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "You have believed because you have seen me. Blessed are those who have not seen yet have believed." And then in this moment, I believe this is where Thomas's life changes. He sees it. His belief is made manifest before him, and he would be transformed into a great evangelist. He would stand with his comrades on the day of Pentecost preaching the gospel, and he would share in the delight of taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. Ancient testimony suggests that Thomas took the gospel as far as India. And to this day, there is a small hill near the airport in Chennai where Thomas is believed to have been buried. There are churches in India that can trace their roots to the beginning of the Christian age, and tradition says that these churches were founded by Thomas. Tradition says that he was martyred by being run through with a spear, a fitting end for one whose faith came to him when he saw the spear mark in his master's side and longed to be reunited with his Lord. That is Thomas. Next week, we're going to triple up with the last three. So we've gone through two groups of four thus far. We have one group of four left. There's three that all have the same names as some other apostle, which is we'll talk about next week, and then our final apostle that will be studied in his own lesson will be Judas. All right. Let's end our class in a prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time that we have to be together as your church and look into your word. God, as we consider your servant Thomas this morning. God, help us to take his example into our lives. Sometimes, God, we can be very pessimistic. We can be very downtrodden in our lives, in our outlook at the world around us. But God, help us to have courage. Help us to have courage that even though things might be bad or the consequence of us sharing our faith might put us on the outside, that we would have courage and faith in you and do it anyways. God, thank you for his example. God, please be with us as we enter into this time of worship, that we might focus on what we're doing, that we might push out all of the distractions of this life and focus solely on you and the work of your Son. We love you. It's in your Son's name that I pray.